Hello and welcome to the Scoreboard Podcast. I'm your host, Rivka Boord of Jets X Factor, the home of the best New York Jets content on the internet. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Subscribe to jetsxfactor.com. Discount code 80. And remember to find us on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. Today we're joined by a special guest, Mike Tanier of the Too Deep Zone Substack, and also of FTN Fantasy. Mike, thanks so much for joining.
It's great being here. We miss you on the Discord. You mentioned that when we were off stage. You got to come back to the DVOA Discord. It's been taken over by 49ers fans.
Okay, well, the Jets played the 49ers in week 1, so you'll definitely get me then. But I'll be back during the season.
Absolutely. Yeah, you got to get back for that one. It's all Brendan Ayuk all the time right now, so we need more balance.
Yeah, okay. Well, I feel like sometimes I talk too much Jets there. Talk about the whole NFL because this is the thing for the whole NFL. But yeah, I'll be back. Okay, so I wanted to start. I watched your AFC East preview with Aaron Schatz, and he said you guys were talking about how you have the Jets projected third in the division at 8.8 wins. I guess I just wanted to ask you, considering you have a team who finished top 6 in defensive DVOA the last 2 seasons and definitely in the bottom 3, and they won 7 games. Do you feel like 8.8 wins is a little bit on the low side for a team that's projected to have the second best defense in the NFL and the 18th best offense?
Yeah, in my gut, I do feel that way. And again, we have them projected, like you said, second best defense. It's not like we're saying, oh, this defense is bad, this defense is going to fall off. It's that 18th on offense that's part of it. And it's the reality of trying to make a projection for a 41-year-old quarterback who did not play last year, coming back with a completely rebuilt offensive line. It's easy in our brains to put Aaron Rodgers and Mike Williams, and now you got the rookie running back and all these things together and say, this is going to be unstoppable. You try to do it analytically, you're going to say, well, you're probably going to get a kind of a tail-off season from Rodgers, and you might have some hiccups along the way. That's part of it. Part of it is the difficulty of the schedule. All the schedules across the AFC East are very, very difficult. And when you start comparing one to the other, it's tricky. I'll add one more thing to that. And this is one where I think DVOA and Aaron Schatz's analysis and me diverge. You mentioned third place. The Almanac has a very high Dolphins rating. The Dolphins, I believe, are higher rated than the Bills in the division right now. I don't feel it. I don't sense it. I don't see what they did to justify that. And that's one of the reasons why the Jets are third, because we have this Dolphins team that we at least think is going to be very strong.
That makes sense, though, because the thing with the Dolphins is you look at their offense, and obviously offense tends to be more predictive of future offense. And the thing is you look at their statistics, and it's like, well, this is going to be a great offense. But then you look at how they played against good teams last year and how Tua Tagovailoa throws in January, and you kind of say things might be a little different. So yeah, it's definitely a difficult projection with a 40-year-old quarterback. The one variable that I feel like may be a little underestimated by DVOA and just nationally in general is Bryce Hall, because Bryce Hall put up 4.5 yards per carry, 0.7 rush yards over expected per carry behind, an offensive line that can kindly be called putrid. Right. He was hit behind the line, I think statistically, higher than any other running back in the NFL. So you put him behind even just a semi-competent offensive line. And do you think that, it's out of the realm of possibility to expect him to be certainly a top 2 running back in the NFL?
It's not out of the realm of possibility at all. And you would probably say that that's certainly a vector that could be like McCaffrey and Saquon and him in this range if this offensive line is rebuilt as good as advertised. But when we talk about projections and when you talk about projecting running backs, that is the world in which you can get into a quagmire very quickly, and you can be super optimistic about the running back who has the injury, has the tail off here. You can very rarely say a running back on the rise. You can very rarely say that because the fall happens almost instantaneously, and it happens unbelievably early. Well, I don't predict that for Hall, and I don't want that to happen for Hall. When you're doing big data projections and you're running thousands of simulations, some of the simulations are saying, hey, this guy gets hurt, this guy isn't as advertised, this offensive line isn't that great, in addition to all the projections that say, oh, Tyrod Taylor's out there by week 5 because something else bad happened.
Okay, I mean that's fair. Again, you're saying you're running simulations and things like that, so it makes sense that the simulations would account for that. The one I'll just give you an interesting stat. When Brees Hall runs behind Elijah Vera Tucker, right, back-to-back
Yes.
season injuries, he averages 6.1 yards per carry. When Elijah Vera Tucker is not out there, he averages 3.9 yards per carry, and that's one competent offensive lineman. We're talking about four other stinky offensive lineman in both of his seasons as an NFL running back.
By the
And
way,
so
3.9 without Elijah Vera Tucker is really good because there's nobody else out there. That's like running by yourself against 11 defenders, and you're still getting to nearly 4 yards. That's pretty darn good.
yeah, so I mean that's kind of where Jets fans' optimism comes from, just watching him make something out of nothing like all the time, and just saying even if this offensive line is, I mean, just more competent than it was the last two seasons, even if it's not, even if you have Tyron Smith getting hurt, old fashion who projects, obviously rookie, better pass blocker than run blocker, even if Elijah Vera Tucker gets hurt again, whatever you want to say, even if Morgan Moses gets hurt, like you look at just some of that line and it's like, how can it get anything but better?
It has to get better. And of course, it has to get better for this team to go anywhere. Otherwise, your 41-year-old quarterback is damaged again. I look at the changes they made at the offensive line, and I'm impressed because they did everything you can ask a team to do that has, cap issues and reality, where you can bring in a Tyron Smith and a Fashanu and say, here are two solutions at left tackle. Okay, that you can have Tippmann out there, that you can bring in guys like Moses and Simpsons. Here are journeyman veteran from good programs that are going to come out there and fix this. And there's depth, and it's not just like nothing behind those guys. That's all very good. It's just a matter of how high you stack it at that point and say, okay, we went from league worst, league bottom 5, danger to themselves and others offensive line to middle of the tier. And I think that's kind of where this offensive line is. It's middle of the tier, and it's a little more durable and more stable. How far does that project the offense up? And that's the undiscovered country. That's the thing that's difficult to project. And at Football Outsiders, at FTN, we tend to project conservatively on things like that.
Okay, and again, obviously it makes sense because again, I live in a little bit of a Jets echo chamber sometimes, where it's like you're all talking about it. It's like if everything goes right, but realistically speaking, when you're projecting out for the whole league, you have to say this is just the average of what's likely to happen given all the unknowns. I mean, we're talking about the offensive line. Tyron Smith misses games every year. And he averages like 5 or 6 missed games a year. Mm-hmm. When you have Mike Williams coming off a torn ACL, how's that going to work?
Right.
Rodgers with the torn Achilles. There's a lot of unknown there. So if everything works out well, and these guys play well, you could end up with a top, a pretty good offense. But on average, you're saying 18th, which the question is really what's the ceiling of your team if you have an 18th ranked offense?
Right. And the ceiling can be rather high because you should have a number 2, number 1, number 3 ranked defense along the way. And of course, there's a question mark somewhere in Japan right now, or I think he's back from Japan, and Haason Reddick, who is, in the breeze a little bit. Have to assume that gets resolved. Even if it doesn't resolve, it's still a very good defense, but you're starting to see chinks there. But like it should be a strong team. I look at this team, and when you say 8.9 wins, that sounds discouraging, but that's kind of how these projections look. A lot of the good teams are around 9. A lot of the bad teams are around 6. It's rare to project 2 and 15 records when you're doing thousands and thousands of simulations. The Jets come in at a 48.4% chance to make the playoffs. I think that's a little low personally, but that's a little bit more of a realistic goal for this team. I don't think Jets fans have to look at themselves right now and say, well, we're a wild card. If things go as planned, the Bills are going to take this division and you're going to be nipping at their heels. Let's put the Dolphins aside for a minute. It's hard to get past that unless you say the 34-year-old Aaron Rodgers is walking through the door again and everything's going to be A-okay. And that's a little sanguine.
Let's say they get from Rodgers what he put up in 2022, which was, I mean, by DVOA was a little below average. By most metrics, if you put it all together, he was mediocre.
Yes.
Let's say they get that level of play from Aaron Rodgers. Do you think that their overall projection is still 18th, or you think it's a little higher?
Maybe it's 16th, 15th, 14th. I think the projection for the team winds up staying the same overall. That this is a team that's like better odds for a wild card. Maybe you get some odds to win the division if the things happen badly for the Bills. But like to kind of push through that ceiling, you have to start saying, oh, we get like this renaissance season from Aaron Rodgers mixed with Breece Hall making plays, mixed with the rookie running back coming in and having an instant impact, mixed with Mike Williams coming back, and to climb that level. Okay, that's great. All those things could go right. Now do that for the Chiefs, do that for the Bills, do that for the Bengals, and this team is left in the dust.
Yeah, no. Again, it's very easy to get lost in that, like, oh, this team got so much better. They won 7 games last year. How much better can they get?
Right.
Yeah. Right. Now you bring up Haason. Sorry.
Yeah, and the trick is and you can say, well, the Chiefs got a little worse. And the Bills did get a little worse, and the Ravens got a little worse because they had attrition along the way. Do they necessarily stack up and meet each other? It doesn't look that way based on everything that DVOA has projected.
Okay. Now, you brought up Haason Reddick, so I wanted to ask you something, especially as an Eagles fan. So this is the way I see the situation with Haason Reddick. I know the Jets look like buffoons in the media, which is not an uncommon experience at all. Mm-hmm. But the way I see it is the Eagles signed Bryce Huff. Mm-hmm. They have Reddick in the final year of his deal. They're looking to dump his salary. Right? Reddick's not happy with his contract, but the way the Jets, I think Joe Douglas saw it is, you have a player, he's unhappy with his deal, he's not getting a long-term deal anywhere else, let's trade for him for below market value and get 1 year, which fits the Jets timeline, out of a player who's put up over 11 sacks for 4 straight seasons. Now, yes, even not working out the money before looks foolish, but I think the way Douglas saw it ultimately is we have all the leverage here because he has to play in order to earn his next deal. If he sits out the whole season, his contract doesn't toll. He ends up, at that point, he's entering his age 31 season. He's not going to get that big deal if he doesn't play.
Yeah, but that was a more of a wish than a plan, wasn't it? Imagine making the same mistake with Ayuk and thinking, well, if we trade for Ayuk, he's going to come in. Well, he could sit in there as well. I think the Reddick situation does resolve itself. We are like past that, the Rubicon of like the fines for missing camp are reaching the place where an extension would get eaten up by the fines along the way. It's just not good form. Okay. And it could result in a guy coming in, maybe not in 100% shape, not 100% with the program, etc. You're right. That could jeopardize his next contract if he doesn't get this one. But these pass rushers tend to go year at a time later in their careers anyway. This is not a guy who was ever like a real negative locker room influence, not in Arizona, not in Carolina, not in Philly until things went haywire at the end of last year. So this should be somebody to work with. It's just an own goal. It is an absolute own goal to say that Douglas did not make some kind of arrangement going into this. And it's a little bit of a Howie going to his old buddy Douglas and pulling another fast one. This is what Howie does. He look what he did with Frank Reich. Oh, I'm your buddy. I'll take care of you. He's going to give you somebody he doesn't want to pay, and you're going to wind up with the headache.
Okay. Now, I hear that. The one thing I will add is that when the Jets traded for Reddick, they also had John Franklin Myers. And the way it kind of works with the Jets defense, what people don't understand is the reason the condition on Reddick's pick, right, 3rd round pick to become a second is 67.5% of the snaps, is because the Jets don't play any of their edge rushers 67.5% of the snaps. Yeah. The highest ratio any Jets edge rusher had last year was 66%, and the year before that it was 58%.
Yes.
So they tend to rotate a lot.
And you've got guys. You got so many guys that you can rotate, so they can actually be fine without them right now. When you got these guys like McDonald and Johnson and these other guys. One thing I'll say is, if the team is more successful, the pass rushers should be on the field more, which will increase that doesn't increase the percentage, but it increases the total if you're out there icing wins and you're rotating these guys while the other team's in hurry up.
Yeah, no, it's true, but the Jets also already play among the most defensive snaps in the NFL just because their defense is on the field all the time. Yeah. So I don't know if they can really get more.
Good point.
Yeah, so I think what happened also is that Reddick may have initially there was some reporting about how there were conversations about how he may have reneged on the verbal agreement, which again, it's business. Yeah. But the thing is, when they had Franklin Myers, he may have looked at it and said, okay, I don't have any leverage. I'm just one of the mix. Whereas when they traded Franklin Myers, now he says, I'm your starting edge rusher. I have more leverage here. You need me. And so he kind of backed off and said, you need to pay me.
Get it done. Get it on paper. Sign on the dotted line. Again, we see sign and trades all the time. This is not an unusual thing. The Joe Douglas and the Jets should not have been blindsided by this.
Okay. I mean, again, I hear it. I just think the way Douglas saw it is 1-year deal. We'll figure it out. We have it. The difference between Ayuk and Reddick is that Ayuk is what, 25?
Right.
And that's the difference between.
Yeah, he has these
long. CeeDee Lamb too.
Right, but one of the things is they're all unhappy with their contract. Moving them around doesn't trade. I mean, the Eagles could have said, "Well, we have the leverage on you. You got to play," and they realized that wasn't working, and that's why.
But they also didn't want a salary. That they didn't want a salary even at the number it was. I think that's why Douglas took it, because he said, "Okay, you want to dump the salary. We're willing to take a salary where it's at. Maybe add a few million in sweeteners." See, this is the thing. Reddick wants 25 to 28 million, according to reports, because that's what Danielle Hunter got. And he sees himself in a similar position, similar age, similar production. Mm-hmm. But the thing is that Danielle Hunter wouldn't have gotten what he got if he was not in a contract, if he wasn't a free agent. Yeah. Because the thing is and the thing is the Jets wouldn't have traded for Reddick they wouldn't have, let's put it this way, they wouldn't have signed him in free agency.
None of this gets him in the camp. None of it's like, well, it's this. He's not there. You traded for him without having the structure in place of saying that this is how we're going to be moving forward. Whether it was some verbal, something out in the wind or not, it wasn't settled all the way. Fixing the blame doesn't fix the problem.
Okay. Yeah. Now, but speaking of Reddick just in general, so the Eagles signed Bryce Huff, right? Yes. And Jet fans were very upset about that, many of them, because in terms of pass rush efficiency, he's like otherworldly.
Yes.
And he's up there with like Micah Parsons and Myles Garrett and some of these guys. The thing about, I want to read you a very interesting stat from Bryce Huff and then talk about what Vic Fangio said about him. Yes. This is what from my colleague Michael Nanny. He said there were 6 games in 2023 where Huff played more than 10 snaps against the run. Comparatively, he only played 16 snaps against the run all year in 2022. In those 6 games where Huff played 10 or more snaps against the run, he only had 13 pressures on 114 pass rush snaps, an 11.4% pressure rate. Mm-hmm. In 9 games where Huff played no more than 7 snaps against the run, he had 50 pressures on 182 pass rush snaps, a rate of 27.4%. Mm-hmm. In other words, when Bryce Huff does not have to account for the run, and he can pin his ears back and rush the passer, he is the best pass rusher in the NFL.
Yeah.
When he has to account for the run in games, he is a slightly below average pass rusher.
Yep. And not a good run defender. And
he's an atrocious run defender. Like, I mean, if you just use PFF grades as shorthand, they gave him a 48 last year. And so what Vic Fangio said about him was that he's not a 3-down player yet. He said, we think he can get there. Do you think Bryce Huff is worth $17 million if he's not an every down player?
If the Eagles are trying to get the Super Bowl in a short window and have Brandon Graham for one more year and have Josh Sweat on the other side and can do some of the rotational things along the way, then he's worth it in the short term because, again, your short-term goal, and I believe his contract is like pushed off a little bit, as a lot of the Eagles contracts are, is to get back quickly. And then you have that possibility of developing a little bit more of a complete game along the way. You also have the possibility of Fangio coming up with a role for him that's kind of specialized. A lot of Eagles contracts moving forward become problems moving forward if you go a little bit down the road and you say, it didn't happen, Eagles didn't return to the Super Bowl. Then there's all kinds of things. Then Saquon becomes a question mark. Like, what was the deal with that? Then you have to start looking at some of the other receiver contracts. And you have to look at paying Graham for another year. So you can see the tactical move there with him. But does potentially have upside, and he does bring that ability. And then you talk about this team that hopes to be leading in the fourth quarter by 10 points, and the run is off the table, and here's Huff out there playing lots and lots of snaps while Brandon Graham has his Gatorade and chuckles on the sideline. That's the hope.
I mean, and that's kind of what the Jets' hope was with him last year. And they did use him to a large extent like that. They used him very much as a specialist. The one thing about the Jets, their coaching is that they tend to get the most out of their defensive players. Yeah. So Huff wanted to play more snaps. The Jets said, we're not going to play you more snaps. We're not playing you against the run.
Right. And Fangio's putting in a whole new system. We saw a little tiny bit of it on Friday night, I think the game was, where there were a 3-man front and Huff was at an outside linebacker in this wide 9 off ball thing with a blitz behind him. And there's going to be things like that. Eagles did not have as much of that with Desai, who was kind of a Fangio apostle who didn't quite have it. Then they had Patricia, holy cow. So it remains to be seen how this works together. One thing Fangio does do, and I know that the coaches in New York do this as well, for the defensive guys, keeps their minds right. Fangio keeps the guys' minds right. Saleh and his guys keep the guys' minds right. Patricia did not, obviously, ever. And so if it becomes this thing where Huff wants to play more and more, they can usually manage that.
Okay, yeah, it's fair. I just kind of wanted to ask you about that because Huff went from the Jets to the Eagles, so it's like that general question. Now, just more in general, I asked Aaron about this. I had him on a few weeks ago, and I asked him about pressure versus sacks as a whole in general.
Yes.
I from a defense, what people talk about all the time is sacks, right? Because that's quantifiable, that looks exciting on film. But in terms of, not just in terms of, let's say, more predictive, but in terms of effect on the game, would you say that a guy who's a big pressure, let's say a big sack guy, but not necessarily as consistent with their pressure, is more valuable than a player who gets a lot of pressure but not as many sacks, or vice versa? Because Haason Reddick and Bryce Huff tend to be on the opposite extremes of that. Huff is a great pressure guy, not necessarily. I know he had 10 sacks last year, but is not necessarily usually a great finisher. Right. Reddick is a great finisher, not necessarily a consistent passer.
It's very tricky because when I see a high sack total with a low pressure rate, I start asking questions about scheme, and I start asking questions about supporting cast and how is this getting done. And analytically, the tools I have at my disposal aren't phenomenal. Like, I'll go grab Sports Info Solution has unblocked sacks, and I'll look at unblocked sacks. Well, if he's coming unblocked, that's scheme, clearly. And then I start looking at things like, well, who on the among the teammates has this high pressure rate, and is somebody flushing this to this individual? Usually, when I look at a guy with a high sack, low pressure, there's skepticism right in there. It's like, is this guy a great finisher, or is he the beneficiary of all of this? Less skeptical about the high pressure rate guys, because sometimes I look at the high pressure rate guy and I will say, this is snap in, snap out basis that he's doing this. Why isn't he finishing? Sometimes it's a defensive tackle and the dude's flushing. Sometimes it's the left tackle and the quarterback just rolls right and he doesn't have a bookend along the way. And usually you can identify the issue. I don't know if Aaron talked about pressure to sack rate. That's becoming the big hot statistic of the last couple of years. More for quarterbacks in terms of saying, well, what percentage of their pressures result in sacks? I think you're seeing something real about they can scramble in a timely manner, get rid of the ball. I think there's something to it for defensive players as well, where you want that in a certain Goldilocks zone where you're getting both, and anything on either side is something that needs to be explored.
Yeah, so the thing about Reddick is he's more of an average. If you look, I'm using PFF's pressure rates. He was average last year in pressure rate. The year before that, he was obviously above average, but he wasn't like, oh, he's getting sacks and he's not getting pressures. It's more he's just better at finishing. Now with Huff, the reason he tends not to finish is he comes off the edge and they get around him, but also he has very short arms. He has like 31-inch arms, which for an edge defender, a lot of times the arm length makes a difference when you can grasp onto the quarterback versus not. But the thing is, he was so disruptive that I always said I prefer the guy who's just going to consistently get in the quarterback's face and drive him crazy.
Right. Somebody else will get those sacks. Reddick is a guy who will get huge wins. He'll come up against a blocker who is just not going to handle him, and the rest of the game is going to be defined by that. And if he's not in that huge win situation, he's facing a tougher offensive tackle, better scheme, et cetera, like that. There's a little more of a neutralization situation. That went back, I think, to his last year in Arizona. I think that went back to his Carolina year. That's who he is. With the Eagles, of course, if you're getting all these wins the previous season, 2022, everybody's winning everywhere, and you're just clobbering people. And then there were less opportunities. Plus, there was a minor injury last year. But, you want – it's good to have a guy, and the Jets have a guy now where, the opponent's got the backup right tackle. I think you see Haason off the left a little bit more. The backup right tackle, the rookie right tackle, the 49ers learned the tight end's going to try and get you. Oops, that's a mistake. It's good. It's good having that guy. I'm trying to think right now who the Dolphins have as their tight end. It's not Gesicki anymore. I forget who it is, but
they signed Jonnu Smith.
Jonnu can block okay, but like bring your A game if that's how you're going to address this, because you'll get a big win, and when you get the big win, you'll get the finish.
Okay, so I think you gave me a little bit more of a nuanced answer of that in terms of the differentiation. Right. I actually have a couple. I know you. Oh, it's almost 10:30 because it's like 10:20.
We got a couple minutes.
Okay, so this is just a general question. It's not a Jet specific question, but when you're talking about, let's say we're talking about Hall of Fame. Look, I covered the Giants last year too, so I just wanted to ask you a general question about how much in your mind does playoff performance influence whether a player should be a Hall of Famer or not? And when I talk about playoff performance, there's also a difference between play on the field and victories. Because Aaron Rodgers has a career 45-13 touchdown to interception ratio in the playoffs with like 101 passer rating. And yet he's won one Super Bowl.
Right.
Eli Manning, people are talking about him as a first ballot Hall of Famer when the guy was thoroughly the definition of mediocre as a quarterback for his career, for most of his career. He was never a top 5 quarterback, was barely ever even a top 10 quarterback, won 2 Super Bowls, never won another playoff game besides that, and yet
besides the playoff games leading this, besides these 6 playoff games,
he won 8. Yeah, he won 8, but I'm saying he was 8 in. I think he lost every other time. He lost in the first round, did not play well in those games. And yet we're talking about, let's say reputation-wise, C.J. Stroud said he'd rather have Eli Manning's career. So to you, when you're evaluating a quarterback, to what extent do you look at their playoff success as a determinant? To what extent do you look at it as a function of a lot of team success and maybe somewhat variable from year to year because it's a small sample size? Like, what's your view on playoff Super Bowls in evaluating a quarterback?
There's so much there. C.J. Stroud said he'd rather have Eli Manning's career than Aaron Rodgers' career. Is that what he said? He
basically said he'd rather have won the 2 Super Bowls, and he said if you put Matthew Stafford in Aaron Rodgers' situation, he would have won 3 or 4 Super Bowls.
Well, I think that's C.J. Stroud reacting to Aaron Rodgers being a public flake. That's what it is. That's Aaron Rodgers' reputation in the minds of younger people coming back to haunt him. And of course, Rodgers is a first ballot Hall of Famer, et cetera. And when we talk about Eli Manning and the whole first ballot Hall of Famer, I don't know who the people are saying that. I don't think that that's voters for the Pro Football Hall of Fame who are working their way up the semifinalists, the finalist list right now. I'm not, making pronouncements. If we take the whole playoff thing, and I kind of correct you a little bit because it's like we took playoffs and Super Bowl. Like you say, Eli 2 rings. Well, that is also 3 playoff victories going along the way. There are a lot of quarterbacks out there who had very good playoff records that didn't necessarily win the Super Bowl, didn't make the Super Bowl. There's a lot there. If you take it away from quarterbacks and you say, for playoff performance, Terrell Davis, did I think Terrell Davis's playoff performances mattered to his Hall of Fame career? I'd say absolutely. When I would advocate for Terrell Davis, I would be like, you guys are missing the 175-yard rushing games in the playoffs moving through as Elway was a little bit older and they're handing off, et cetera. So I don't like trivializing the idea that a quarterback, whether he gave good statistics or whatever, led a team to a series of victories going to the Super Bowl. And as you know, on my Substack, Too Deep Zone, I've been doing top 5 quarterbacks of history, for each team in their history. And you get these quarterback after quarterback after quarterback, and then they get to the playoffs and lost. You get to the playoffs and they got to the first round and lost. And it really speaks to the shape of their career sometimes. So I don't want to put Eli Manning on the first ballot of the Hall of Fame. I don't want to get too deeply into that. It should be significant. It should be. It should matter. I don't think we should discount. He was mediocre in many of the seasons. He was only top 10 quarterback maybe in his best seasons. That's all true. We should not discount that. And we should not discount the fact that those were 2 unbelievable runs with some very mediocre teams, with some very mediocre Giants teams. I'm actually writing about this week. It's like, go back and say, okay, that team won 2 Super Bowls. Why? Who were the stars?
Osi Umenyiora, Michael Strahan, basically. Justin Tuck.
Strahan was only on one of those.
It was in 07, but yes. Justin Tuck,
yes,
pretty much their defensive line.
Yeah, and those were very great guys. Are those the 1985 Bears? No. Are those the 1986 Giants? No. They're from very good players. Receivers? Plaxico. Somebody had to be good. So you have to look at Eli and say, we can't just say, well, that was a fluke and David Tyree caught the ball like that and Wes Welker did this and that's why it happened. You got to take it with a little more nuance.
I mean, that's the way I look at it, though, because again, I watched all those games. 07, 11, I watched all those games, and the thing you came up with is, yeah, they won the game, but other than a lead throw to Mario Manningham, which again, I'm not discounting. To me, that's one of the greatest throws of all time. Yeah. But you look at the rest of just how he played, and he basically played as a game manager.
Yeah.
Meaning he didn't really win them the game. He just didn't lose them the game for the most part.
Right, but that's a hell of a distinction to make when it happens twice against the team of the generation. And then and then you look around and say, well, who did it? And it's like, well, Tuck had a great game and everything like that. He's not Lawrence Taylor. So you can't look at it like you did with Phil Simms. You can look at Phil Simms like, well, how did you get to these Super Bowls? Like Lawrence Taylor smothered everybody in his path and just cleared a path for you. Okay, that's fair. That's good. Eli, there's some of that. Who's his head coach? Now, I think Tom Coughlin's a Hall of Famer personally. Okay. I think Tom Coughlin's a Hall of Famer. But you can say, well, Tom Coughlin is Newt Rockne and he made that happen. That's weird. That's not his reputation outside of that. So, again, you want to take that, and then you want to take the fact that he had mediocre season after, above average season, let's put it that way, over above average season with no great ones, maybe one great one. 2011 was a really great year.
Yeah.
Then you put him on the ballot with 15 other finalists for the Hall of Fame. You put him out there with your Torrey Holt, Reggie Wayne, everybody who's on the ballot, who comes on the ballot this year. And then you talk about their careers, and then you have a sober conversation about it. And I don't think he gets in on the first ballot. But what about the second, the third? What if Eli Manning's been on the ballot for 8 years and you start to recognize, boy, we put a lot of guys in ahead of him. Maybe then you just look at it and say, wow, this is the time. And that's how the Hall of Fame really works. It's not, all of us on Twitter or Threads or whatever we're on now. Like two rings, got to put them in. Or those idiots are going to put him in because of 2 rings when he sucked. It's much more of who is the field of 15 guys and who deserves to become one of the 5 that gets in.
So let's say, just comparing him to Matthew Stafford, then Stafford won 1 ring, right? You don't think Stafford? But Stafford year in and year out has been a better quarterback than Eli Manning. Like you just look at their like, I mean, I haven't looked at their DVOA stats or things like that, but just from a pure production angle, Stafford played on a lot of worse teams, but not all of them. But Eli earlier in his career, 05, 06, 07, 08, had pretty decent teams around him. Like as a whole, like again, I know he had, you said not a great, but he had a pretty good offensive line those seasons. He had Tiki Barber, 04, 05, 06 was one of the best running backs in the league. He had Plaxico, who at that time was a top 8 receiver in the NFL, something like that. And he had that defensive line. And Stafford played with the Lions, who were miserable.
Calvin Johnson.
Okay. Yes, I understand that you throw into triple coverage and it's there. I get it.
A current Hall of Famer on his side there, and a great defensive line led by Dominican Sue and Cliff Avril for many years. I didn't mean to interrupt you with that, but Stafford didn't have anything in Detroit. He had a current, as of now, already in Hall of Famer with him. Okay. And I overtalk you. I don't mean to do that, but
I meant as a team. Like if you're saying Super Bowls, if you led a team to a Super Bowl, Stafford didn't really have much of a shot at leading. I know he had Megatron and but was there a realistic shot of leading? There's a reason that when he went to the Rams and he had a loaded defense, a stacked defense, that he kind of sort of rode the coattails of that defense to a Super Bowl. Like that Super Bowl itself, they won because of Aaron Donald and not because of Matthew Stafford.
Right, which is why Stafford's not a Hall of Famer, because, again, that Super Bowl, Aaron Donald will be a Hall of Famer off of that team. I don't know if Cooper Kupp will make it. I don't know. Whitworth might be a Hall of Famer at left tackle. Mm-hmm. And when you go back to his Lions career, and we can see the production, we saw him throw and say, man, he can throw the football. The argument becomes with Stafford that Stafford and Calvin Johnson would be 2 Hall of Famers on this team, and then you had Dominican Sue and a great defensive line, and they couldn't win a playoff game. So that's where you go playoffs versus Super Bowl, and you look at playoff performances.
Well, a called back pass interference had a lot to do with that, but against they were playing the Cowboys, and
that's true. And then you have to stack all these things, but that gets you your 1 playoff win. If you got that, and now you're doing if and what, and then you can start playing. Well, what if this guy did this along the way? Stafford's not a Hall of Famer. I don't think he's going to be taken seriously as a Hall of Famer unless they go back to the Super Bowl in the next year or two. It's different. Matt Ryan is not a Hall of Famer. I know people on Twitter like to say he's a Hall of Famer. He's not. He's not going to get there. He probably will never make finalists. Probably a better quarterback than either of them.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Matt Ryan was a better quarterback year over year than Eli Manning. So then are we just saying that Super Bowl runs make him like, it's upset me because ultimately you play most of your career is played in the regular season. So shouldn't we kind of like take the whole career into account? Like, let's say guys like Tony Romo and Donovan McNabb. I know they're not going to be Hall of Famers, but to me, they were worlds better than Eli Manning as quarterbacks.
Right, but accomplishments matter, and a quarterback is a leadership position, and I don't like to do quarterback wins, but you have to show a body of work that's accomplishments as a head coach, as a quarterback, because that's a reflection of your team's performance. And when these guys fall short, Ryan is closer. Ryan is closer because you can look at that Super Bowl. He was the MVP that year, and he's leading 28-3, and his defense lets him down, and you could have that conversation with him. Don't think you can have it with McNabb. I don't think you can have it with Romo. And you can go back through the history of football and you can find these guys. You can take your Kenny Andersons and your Boomer Esiasons. But the accomplishment has to matter. The feat has to matter. I think those of us in the analytics community, we have a hard time because we're used to predicting, and you have to post-dict a little bit when you are talking about something like a Hall of Fame that's supposed to be driven by what your historical merit was. And when we predict, and say, okay, it's 2007. Which quarterback do you want, Ryan, Stafford, or Eli? Most of us like, give me Ryan, or that would have been in his college year, but give me one of the other guys along the way. Then when you post-dict and you go back and you start saying, well, this guy would have been this, if this, and this, and we start tacking Julio Jones versus Calvin Johnson versus Plaxico Burress and all these things, you get hit with the wall of, and then there was this guy who twice, with a team that was not full of Hall of Famers, rose up, beat the team of the generation. We lived through it. Go back to like the 50s and 60s and say, well, you know what? Maybe Bobby Lane wasn't that good. Well, it's like he led the team of the generation, et cetera, et cetera. When you start doing things like this, you realize, again, I don't want to put Eli Manning in the Hall of Fame in the first ballot. But when you start like minimizing the accomplishment, there's a chance that maybe we're missing something, and maybe that something's the forest from the trees, the guy who did this stuff. We're one step away from having a Justin Herbert argument. You know that, right? We're almost we're on the fringe of that. The person does the stuff has to demonstrate the greatness, because greatness is something that you do, not necessarily something that you are.
I mean, that's where my argument was going to be about Patrick Mahomes last year, where he didn't have a great regular season. If you look at a lot of his metrics compared to Aaron Rodgers is from 2022, they're eerily similar. They're actually eerily similar. And yet he was the Super Bowl. I mean, I can't say I believe he was a Super Bowl MVP. I think Chris Jones was, to be honest. But again, that to me means he rode his defense to a Super Bowl. I understand he won the Super Bowl and he made the big plays when you needed it. Right. But I don't look at that as the same as his other teams when he carried his team to the Super Bowl.
But you don't look at him and say some of the things that Patrick Mahomes brought to the table in an off year mattered. The idea that him and Kelsey can do this almost telepathic thing with each other. The fact that a guy, even something like that's kind of off the table, aside that Chris Jones says, I'm coming back, I'm signing the contract, and I'm coming back. Why? Because of Patrick Mahomes. That provides an element along the way, that there's these things that don't necessarily look good in the big data. Like the idea that I'm going to get the ball to Marquez Valdez-Scantling, even though he dropped the last 6 of them. That 4-yard scramble doesn't look like anything much. That's not something anybody else in the NFL could do. There's a lot of things like that to add up to say, obviously, Patrick Mahomes, best player in the NFL right now, did things that weren't statistical. And it does then make you look back and say, well, what other statistical things might we have missed? For your average rank and file quarterback, I don't think you have to go worrying about, maybe we missed something about Kirk Cousins in 2014. It doesn't matter. Then with Eli, and you have these 2 Super Bowls out there as outliers, you do have to ask yourself, is there something that isn't in the statistics that he might have been doing?
So I think the argument you're making basically is that we have to look beyond the numbers when we're talking about a Hall of Fame conversation.
Yeah. You have to realize that you're not looking at this as saying who deserves a $200 million contract for the next 5 years or who's going to win next year. In analytics, we do that constantly. It's appropriate that we do that. We are supposed to be making predictions, helping fans see differently, help teams see a different future. And then there's a part of the brain that you have to like turn the volume down a little bit and saying, what did this guy do? Again, I'm not a big Eli for Hall of Fame guy, but I bristle at this like suggestion, like those idiots are just going to look at his rings. It's like, it's a little more nuanced than that when you look at the breadth of human history. And I will say you should look at playoff performance overall for every player, because that's a big part of it. And you mentioned the regular season's the regular season. Some of these guys who have Hall of Fame resumes have a dozen playoff games. These are the dozen most important games of his career. And it's like a season, 12, 13, 14 games are like a season. And you can look at it and say, what did that individual do in that season? McNabb is a good example. He has 16 playoff games. He was 9-7 in the playoffs. Okay. So this is a huge body of work. Now I look at that and say it's not Hall of Fame worthy because you don't win that Super Bowl. You lose all those championship games, but it gets you close because of what's there. Somebody else who's 11-5 in those and has more touchdowns, whatever, it might be a different story.
Okay. I think we could probably end it there, but I'm sure like Jet fans are like, oh, why are you talking about this? But I'm like, this is an analytics guy. We have to talk a little bit about general NFL things and not just specifically Jets.
Get DeBrickashaw into a Hall of Fame conversation. There's a good one. DeBrickashaw and Mangold could be in Brickashaw better, I think. We can't argue about.
Really, I think Mangold better, but yeah.
Yeah, maybe. Okay, can't talk about Klecko anymore. He's in, but that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay, if you bring it into, we're bringing it into Jets terms over here. Okay, so I wanted to give you a chance just to plug your stuff, what you're doing, talk about where people can find you. I know you have some of it there, but whatever you want to plug.
Yes, first of all, I want to plug the Football Outsiders Almanac. You guys are all analytics people, so I'm guessing you have it. I misnamed it a moment ago. It is no longer the Football Outsiders Almanac. That's twice. That's 2 quarters in the swear jar. It is the Aaron Schatz' FTN Football Almanac 2024. You can get it at ftnfantasy.com. You can look at all the other services they have there. A lot of stats, a lot of sortable things. Great for wagerers, great for fantasy players, great for analytics-minded folks along the way. And you can check that out. My Substack is the Too Deep Zone Substack. It is MikeTanier.substack.com. We do a little bit of analytics. We do a lot of history, especially in the offseason. Right now, I'm watching preseason games. I'm getting information, and I'm talking about what's happening in the NFL right now. So MikeTanier.substack.com. Please come check it out.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mike, for joining. Again, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Subscribe to JetsXFactor.com, discount code 80, and check us out on Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.